It's 1945. Japan's proud merchant fleet, once the lifeline of an empire stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific, has vanished. Oil tankers, gone. Troop transports, gone. Even the mighty Imperial Navy, once feared across Asia, is starving for fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts. And the shock isn't from giant battleships or thunderous bombers. It's from a silent force. The Japanese high command never truly feared American submarines. By the end of the war, U.S. submarines, just 2% of the Navy's manpower, had destroyed over 55% of all Japanese ships sunk. Japan's supply lines didn't just weaken, they collapsed beyond belief. Tonight, we reveal how America's submarine tactics evolved from a disastrous beginning to one of the most devastating and decisive campaigns in naval history. The Pacific in 1941 was a world of vast distances, thousands of miles of open ocean, isolated islands, and supply lines stretching from Indonesia to Korea, China, and the Japanese home islands. Japan relied on the sea for everything: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Southeast Asia, food from China, and iron ore from Manchuria. And the Imperial Japanese Navy, powerful, proud, and deeply committed to battleship doctrines, believed its strategy was unbreakable. But below the waves, a different kind of war was about to begin. A silent war, a secret war, and one the Japanese never imagined would determine their fate. When most people recall December 7, 1941, they picture burning battleships, strafing fighters, and the shock that shook America. But hidden behind the smoke was a weapon almost completely overlooked: the U.S. submarine fleet. Dozens of American subs sat in Pearl Harbor's submarine base, damaged. Japan never knocked them out. In fact, most were sitting fully operational, waiting for orders. A few hours after the attack, those orders came: execute unrestricted submarine warfare. The United States, without fanfare or hesitation, became the first major nation in World War II to declare unrestricted submarine warfare from day one. U.S. submarines now had the green light to sink anything: military ships, transports, tankers. No warnings, no rules, no second chances. This single decision would become one of the most devastating strategic moves of the war. But at first, it didn't work. In the early months of the Pacific War, U.S. submarine crews sailed out with confidence, only to return frustrated, humiliated, and sometimes in disbelief. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of the American submarine fleet, was a disaster. It ran too deep. It frequently failed to detonate. Sometimes it detonated too early, and occasionally it would turn around and circle back toward the submarine that fired it. I had more faith in the Japanese depth charges than in my own torpedoes, and yet Washington insisted the torpedoes were fine. This failure nearly crippled the submarine force before the real war even began. But there was no turning back. Submarine captains had to innovate, adapt, and sometimes break orders just to make their weapons work. Amid this chaos, another problem surfaced. American submarine tactics were outdated. The U.S. Navy had long trained for a fleet: submarine roll subs, supporting battleships, not hunting merchant ships across thousands of miles. The Pacific War demanded something entirely different: stealth, aggression, lightning-fast decision-making, and the nerve to attack convoys guarded by destroyers that were often more experienced than the American crews themselves. But change was coming, and soon, the silent service would evolve into the deadliest anti-shipping force in the world. To understand how U.S. submarines eventually crippled Japan, you must first understand the Japanese mindset. Japan simply did not take submarine warfare seriously. Before the war, the Imperial Navy viewed submarines as scouting units, meant to shadow enemy fleets and report their movements. Merchant shipping, fuel tankers, supply convoys, the Japanese considered them unworthy targets. Their doctrine was built on decisive battles, the Grand Contacaison, a final clash of fleets that would determine the fate of nations. This obsession blinded them to the very Achilles heel that American submarines would soon exploit. Japan also failed to build convoy escorts, failed to protect its supply lines, and failed to mass-produce merchant ships. They began the war with just over 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By 1944, that number had collapsed to less than half. The reason: the U.S. submarine force had learned how to fight back. The men of the silent service are known but unbelievably brave. When people think of World War II heroes, they imagine Marines storming beaches or pilots dueling in the skies. But the U.S. submarine crews lived in a different world entirely. Cramped steel tubes where 80 men shared one shower. Air thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Depth charges ripping the ocean apart, shaking the sub violently, sometimes for hours. Missions lasting 50 to 70 days. Always silent, always hidden, always one mistake away from death. A submariner once said, "You never saw the enemy until he was sinking, or until his depth charges were exploding around you." These men weren't just warriors. They were hunters, innovators, and soon, the most feared threat Japan had ever faced. In the early months of 1942, the American submarine campaign was still struggling: bad torpedoes, old tactics, and commanders who lacked combat experience. But by the end of that year, the tide would turn. Japan didn't know it, but a storm was coming beneath the waves, a storm that would soon choke off an empire. By mid-1942, the United States had finally entered the brutal reality of submarine warfare in the Pacific. But the early months weren't the triumphant beginning many assume. In fact, they were painfully chaotic. The silent service was still finding its footing, and Japan had no idea how close it was to facing a weapon that would eventually strangle its entire war machine. When American submarines began their first war patrols after Pearl Harbor, there was a surreal sense of contradiction. On paper, U.S. submarines were modern marvels, Gatokless and later Valor-class steel giants capable of crossing the entire Pacific Ocean. They carried 24 torpedoes, 4 forward tubes, 2 aft, and had the endurance for missions that lasted 2 months. But the crews, they were inexperienced, sometimes unsure, and facing an enemy that had spent decades preparing for naval supremacy. Early patrol reports often opened with the same frustrating line: torpedo failed to detonate, or worse, torpedo ran deep, missed target. One captain near the Philippines watched his torpedo detonate harmlessly, beneath a Japanese transporter at least 15 feet deeper than intended. Another skipper recorded a hit on a Japanese freighter only for the torpedo to thunk against the hull and sink without exploding. This wasn't simply a technical issue, this was a mental battle. Crews were risking everything, only for their weapons to betray them. The Mark 14 torpedo disaster deserves its own spotlight because it nearly doomed the entire submarine war. The problems were threefold: depth control malfunction, the torpedo ran 8 to 15 feet too deep; magnetic exploder failures, it detonated early, late, or not at all; contact exploder defects, even direct hits often resulted in zero explosion. But what made it worse was the Navy Bureau of Ordnance's attitude. They insisted the torpedoes worked perfectly. Sub-skippers, however, knew the truth. As one commander famously wrote in his patrol log, "We do not fear the Japanese. We fear our torpedoes." The silent service was fighting the enemy, and fighting Washington at the same time. But change was coming, and it would start with a handful of bold, frustrated submarine captains willing to break the rules. Commander Swede Mommsen and the revolt of the skippers. Charles Swede Mommsen, a visionary officer known for inventing life-saving submarine escape equipment, became a central figure in solving the torpedo crisis. When multiple submarine captains returned from patrols with the same complaints, Mommsen did what the Bureau of Ordnance would not. He tested the torpedoes himself. He ordered real-world experiments in Hawaii, firing torpedoes at cliffs, at nets, even at stationary targets. The results were undeniable. Some torpedoes detonated prematurely. Some detonated behind the target. Some didn't detonate at all. Many ran significantly deeper than the depth settings. Mommsen sent these findings to Washington. At first, Navy leadership resisted, but evidence was mounting, and the complaints were too widespread to ignore. By late 1943, the Mark 14 torpedo had been redesigned from the inside out. Now it worked almost flawlessly. The silent service finally had the weapon it needed, and once it did, the ocean would turn into a graveyard for Japanese shipping. Japan's strategic blindness deepens. Meanwhile, Japan still had no idea how serious the submarine threat was becoming. The Imperial Navy was obsessed with large unit operations, fleet battles, carrier strikes, island attacks. Their submarine designs reflected this philosophy: sleek, fast boats meant for scouting and attacking warships, but attacking merchant shipping. Beneath their dignity, Japan did not build enough escort destroyers, but implement convoy systems early in the war, train dedicated anti-submarine officers, or invest in sonar the way Britain and the US had. Most stunning of all, Japan entered the war with only 6 million tons of merchant shipping, and wartime replacements were slow and limited. Every tanker, every freighter, every transport ship was irreplaceable. The United States understood this. Submarine commanders understood this. Japan did not. We did not believe the Americans would use submarines against our merchant ships. It was a mistake so great that it borders on criminal. This blind spot would be the crack that U.S. submarines eventually ripped open into a fatal wound. By 1943, a new breed of U.S. submarine captain emerged, men who were fearless, innovative, and determined to change the course of the war beneath the waves. These commanders included Commander Dick O'Kane, USS Tang, one of the most aggressive submarine skippers in history. O'Kane's tactics would become famous: night surface attacks, daring close-range ambushes, and fast evasion maneuvers. Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, USS Wahoo, a legend. Morton transformed the timid sub-USS Wahoo into a nightmare for Japanese shipping. His partnership with Dick O'Kane, then his executive officer, became one of the most lethal combinations in submarine warfare. Commander Eugene Fluckey, USS Barb, a creative tactician who sank more tonnage than almost any sub-commander and later launched the only ground operation on the Japanese home islands. These men brought something new to the Pacific: aggression, instinct, calculated, risk-taking. They didn't just attack convoys, they dismantled them. In one patrol, the USS Wahoo dove into a heavily guarded convoy and sank multiple ships before the Japanese escorts even understood what was happening. The U.S. submarine force was evolving into a coordinated, deadly machine. Convoys. Japan still refused to adapt. Even after dozens of ships disappeared, Japan delayed implementing a proper convoy system until late 1943, and even then, escorts were too few, convoys were poorly coordinated, air cover was inconsistent, and anti-submarine tactics were outdated. The Pacific was simply too vast. Japan was bleeding ships faster than it could protect them, and faster than it could build new ones. American subs began forming wolf packs inspired by German tactics in the Atlantic. But unlike German U-boats operating in crowded waters, U.S. wolf packs had the endless expanse of the Pacific to exploit. Convoys that Japan believed were finally safe now faced attacks from multiple sides. By early 1944, Japan's supply system was cracking. But the real shock was still ahead. The silent service was about to unleash a level of destruction that would collapse Japan's entire logistical network, military and civilian alike, and Japan would never recover. By 1943, a quiet transformation had taken place beneath the Pacific waves. The American submarine force, once crippled by malfunctioning torpedoes, timid tactics, and inexperienced command, had evolved into something fierce, precise, and brutally effective. Japan didn't know it yet, but its worst nightmare was already underway. The silent war was about to erupt into devastation so severe that Japanese admirals later admitted they never even saw it coming. With a Mark 14 torpedo fixed by late 1943, submarine captains suddenly possessed a weapon worthy of their courage, and the difference was immediate. Patrol reports that once described agonizing failures now told a very different story. Torpedo hit midship, enemy ship sinking rapidly. To direct hits, tanker aflame, breaking apart. Convoy scattered, we are pursuing the stragglers. The U.S. submarine fleet had been fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Now both hands were free on. The crews were hungry. Japan's merchant fleet began to vanish from the map. No boat symbolized this rise more dramatically than the USS Wahoo. Under Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton was bold, sometimes reckless, and absolutely relentless. His philosophy was simple: we're here to sink ships, not to count them, and sink ships he did. The January 1943 patrol, a legend is born. During Wahoo's third patrol, Morton turned the sub into a one-boat wrecking crew. He penetrated a convoy at night in the surface, something rarely attempted before. He attacked from point-blank range, weaving between Japanese escorts. He fired spreads with deadly accuracy, and he sank ship after ship after ship. Japanese reports initially dismissed it as exaggerated American propaganda, but then more convoys vanished. A commander with terrifying aggression was stalking the seas. Japanese intelligence began circulating a new phrase among merchant crews: Akuma no Ma, Sensuiken, the devil submarine. But if Wahoo was the spark, the USS Temps, under Commander Richard O'Kane, was the wildfire. Where Morton had been daring, O'Kane was surgical. His techniques became textbook submarine warfare: night surface attacks at high speed, firing at extremely close ranges, sometimes less than 1,000 yards, rapid reloads that stunned even fellow submariners, using the sub-silhouette to blend with darkness, attacking from inside the convoy, not outside it. One Japanese sailor later recalled, "The submarine did not come from the outside. It was suddenly among us, as if it rose from the ocean itself." USS Tang's sinkings were so numerous and so rapid that Japanese shipping lanes began to resemble graveyards. Ships vanished with no warning. No survivors, no time to signal distress. Japan had built its empire on maritime lifelines. Now those lifelines were being severed one by one. The moment that truly shocked Japanese commanders came in early 1944. Japan's oil tankers, vital for fueling battleships, carriers, aircraft, and vehicles, began disappearing at catastrophic rates. Submarines did not focus solely on freighters anymore. They targeted tankers, refined oil carriers, coal transports, raw material ships, troop carriers, and each loss cut Japan's lifeline deeper. By mid-1944, Japan had lost more than half of its tanker fleet. Oil storage in Japan fell to 3% of pre-war levels. Many airfields rationed aviation fuel so tightly that pilots could only fly once a week, sometimes once a month. A Japanese logistics officer wrote after the war, "Our ships could not bring us oil. Our war ended the moment our oil stopped flowing." This wasn't an exaggeration. It was a confession, and a shocking realization that came far too late. As 1944 progressed, the U.S. silent service shifted into a terrifying new gear: wolfpack operations. Small groups of submarines, usually 3, were assigned to choke points: Luzon Strait, East China Sea, South China Sea, Formosa Strait. These were the arteries of the Japanese Empire, and wolfpacks began carving them open. By early 1944, the Luzon Strait became one of the most lethal hunting grounds in the world. Convoys entering the strait faced coordinated attacks: one submarine ahead, one behind, one on the flank. No matter how a convoy turned, it ran straight into a torpedo spread. Japanese sailors later called this area Shinju no Mishi, the Road of Pearls, because oil tankers struck by torpedoes left shimmering trails of burning fuel across the sea. Convoy after convoy was annihilated in a single 4-month period. American submarines sank. 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping losses, over 30% of tanker tonnage. Japan was not just losing ships, it was losing the ability to wage war. Submarines weren't only targeting merchant fleets, they were striking at the heart of the Imperial Navy, and the result stunned Japan more than any carrier battle. In June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese supercarrier Wahoo, pride of the fleet, was sunk by a single torpedo from USS Albacore. Japan couldn't believe it. Wahoo had been designed to withstand torpedo hits, but US subs were no longer firing defective weapons. The shock rippled through Japanese high command, but nothing prepared them for what came next. In November 1944, USS Archerfish sank Shinano, the largest carrier ever put to sea at the time, a ship so enormous, so secret, so heavily armored, yet it was destroyed by a submarine stalking it for hours. Japan's greatest warship lasted just 17 hours after leaving port. Admiral Soemu Toyoda later admitted, "It was a humiliation we struggled to understand." A single submarine had undone years of work. The silent service was no longer the underdog. It was the dominant predator of the Pacific, starving Japan, smashing its warships, shredding its convoys, and crippling its empire from beneath the waves. But the collapse was only beginning. By early 1944, Japan's commanders sensed something was fundamentally wrong. Ships weren't just being delayed, they were disappearing. The entire convoys were vanishing without survivors. Oil was no longer arriving, food shortages were spreading, factories were idling, and the Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, was slowly being paralyzed. But the Japanese high command still believed it could endure. They still believed they could regroup. They still believed their fleet could fight one more decisive battle. They didn't yet understand that the real battle was already lost beneath the waves. By mid-1944, American submarines weren't just hunting Japanese shipping, they were controlling the Pacific Ocean's arteries. Every choke point, every shipping lane, every refueling route, submarines were waiting. The U.S. Navy's submarine intelligence began identifying Japan's supply patterns with astonishing precision. When convoys left Hong Kong, when tankers departed Borneo or the Dutch East Indies, when troop transports sailed for the Philippines, which routes were lightly defended, where escorts were thinnest, how long Japanese ships took to refuel. Never before had submarines been used in such a coordinated, intelligence-driven manner, and the result was catastrophic for Japan. One of the most dramatic turning points came from something Japan didn't even know existed: American code. The U.S. Navy SOP to OG and Station HYPO in Hawaii were breaking Japanese naval codes with increasing accuracy. Ultra-intelligence allowed submarines to know convoy departure dates, predict routes, anticipate evasive maneuvers, identify high-value targets, intercept troop reinforcements, one submarine commander said. It was as if we were reading their mail before they mailed it. This intelligence transformed submarines from lone hunters into precision-guided weapons. Convoys that should have been safe protected by escorts, sailing at night, zigzagging, ran straight into American torpedoes. Japan never understood how American submarines always appeared at the right place at the right time. In 1944, the East China Sea, once Japan's most vital shipping lane, turned into something close to a naval slaughterhouse. This region carried coal from Korea, food from China, troops bound for the Philippines, raw materials for Japanese factories. It was the empire's most critical lifeline, and American submarines essentially sealed it off. Operation Banana and the complete blockade. Our subs began patrolling in rotating cycles, ensuring that at any given time, multiple boats were waiting across the East China Sea's key exits: Taiwan Strait, Korea Strait, Luzon Strait. If a ship passed one submarine, it risked running into another, or another, or another. Convoys were torn apart. Ships burned to the waterline. Tankers erupted with massive fireballs that lit the night sky for miles. Japanese sailors named the area Shinoyumi, the Sea of Death. Japan's desperate attempts to adapt. By late 1944, Japan finally understood the severity of the submarine threat. But everything they tried failed. 1. Emergency convoy system. Japan began grouping ships into larger convoys, but this only made them larger targets. 2. More escorts. Japan converted fishing boats and trawlers into anti-submarine escorts, but these vessels had weak sonar, inexperienced crews, almost no depth charges, poor training. They were no match for American subs. 3. New tactics. Convoys tried zigzagging, traveling at night, and hugging coastlines. Submarines adapted every time. As one U.S. skipper put it, whatever route they chose, we were already waiting. By the last months of 1944, Japan's industrial collapse had accelerated beyond repair. Battleships remained tied to the dock. Aircraft carriers couldn't launch full air groups because they lacked aviation fuel. Fighter pilots trained on bicycles because they couldn't waste fuel on real aircraft. Destroyers were rationed so severely they could only escort a handful of convoys. One Japanese air commander bitterly wrote, "We had planes, but no fuel. We had pilots, but no engines. We had courage, but courage alone cannot fly." Factories grind to a halt. Japan's aircraft production plummeted because aluminum shipments stopped, steel shipments stopped, rubber shipments stopped, machine tool imports stopped, coal shipments from Korea were cut by 60%, all because submarines were annihilating everything that floated. In late 1944, a massive Japanese convoy left Singapore carrying aviation fuel replacement aircraft reinforcements, food, munitions, spare engine parts. This convoy carried the lifeblood Japan desperately needed to keep fighting. Waiting for them were American submarines in wolf-pack formation. It became one of the most devastating convoy ambushes of the war. Within hours, tankers exploded, troop transports capsized, ammunition ships detonated with mushroom cloud fireballs. Escorts chased phantoms as submarines vanished into the deep. A Japanese officer later wrote, "It seemed as if the ocean itself turned against us. Only a handful of ships limped home." Japan had lost the last significant shipment of aviation fuel it would ever receive in the war. The shock was immediate, and the consequences were fatal. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy, once one of the strongest in the world, faced a situation no navy could survive. There was no more fuel. Battleships and cruisers couldn't leave port. Carriers were reduced to floating barracks. Destroyers lacked fuel for training. Submarines couldn't patrol. Japan still had thousands of planes, but with fuel reserves desperately low, almost none of them could fly. An admiral wrote in his private diary, "We have ships, we have guns, we have brave men, but the submarines have taken our war from us." This was the moment Japan realized the truth. They were trapped, surrounded, isolated, starved. The ocean that once carried their empire's wealth now carried American submarines. But there was one final act left in this undersea war, one that would push Japan's navy to the brink of collapse. By 1945, the U.S. submarine campaign had reached its apex. What had begun as a tentative, frustrated effort in 1942 had transformed into a merciless juggernaut that Japan could neither evade nor stop. The silent service had turned the Pacific Ocean into an American kill zone, and Japanese commanders were facing the undeniable reality. Their empire was crumbling not from grand battles, but from tiny steel predators beneath the waves. In the early months of 1945, American submarines achieved a level of operational dominance never seen before. They no longer merely attacked convoys, they controlled the seas. High-value targets like oil tankers and troop transports were sunk before leaving port. Convoy after convoy was decimated in near-perfect coordination. Japanese shipping lanes effectively disappeared from maps of the Pacific. The result was catastrophic. Japan's war effort became unsustainable. Fuel shortages reached critical levels. Troops were stranded on distant islands, and vital supplies never reached the home islands. By this point, Japan's logistical collapse was complete. While merchant shipping was the primary target, the silent service still dealt decisive blows to the Imperial Navy. One of the most shocking events came in November 1944 with the USS Archerfish and the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. The Shinano had barely left Yokosuka harbor when Archerfish found her. The massive ship was tracked for hours with meticulous patience. 4 torpedoes struck Shinano in rapid succession. Despite her size and armor, she capsized and sank in just 17 hours after leaving port. This single engagement demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of American submarines. Even the largest, most modern warships could be obliterated by silent hunters that Japan underestimated. By 1945, the U.S. Navy perfected wolfpack tactics in the Pacific. Multiple submarines coordinated attacks on strategic choke points. Convoys sailing through the South China Sea or East China Sea were systematically hunted and destroyed. Submarines used intelligence from code-breaking and reconnaissance to strike at the most vulnerable points. One infamous example occurred in early 1945, when a convoy attempting to deliver aviation fuel and reinforcements to the Philippines was intercepted. 5 tankers were sunk in hours. Several troop transports were destroyed, leaving thousands stranded. Japanese escorts could only watch as American subs appeared and vanished with deadly precision. A Japanese officer later recalled, "The submarines were everywhere, yet nowhere. It was as if the sea itself had risen against us." By mid-1945, Japan's supply lines were entirely severed. Oil reserves were depleted, grounding nearly all remaining aircraft and immobilizing surface ships. Food shortages became severe in both the military and civilian sectors. Troop reinforcements could not reach Pacific Islands, leaving garrisons isolated and vulnerable. Even Admiral Soemu Toyoda, a senior Japanese naval commander, admitted, "Our fleet exists in name only. We have ships but no fuel. We have planes but no gas." The submarines have won before a single fleet battle was fought. The silent service had achieved the ultimate victory. Japan could no longer sustain its empire. The impact of the submarine campaign extended beyond physical destruction. Japanese morale plummeted as the war dragged on. Merchant sailors dreaded sailing because of the invisible killer lurking in every convoy. Naval officers feared the loss of entire fleets without seeing the enemy. Civilians faced food and fuel shortages as a direct result of the submarine blockade. One Japanese naval officer wrote after the war, We had no idea that small submarines, so few in number, could bring our entire maritime world to its knees. The psychological shock of unseen, unstoppable attacks paralyzed decision-making in Tokyo and within the Navy. The silent service had achieved both material and mental victory, crippling Japan's ability to fight on every front. By the end of the war, U.S. submarines sank 1,314 Japanese ships totaling over 5.3 million tons. Over 50% of Japan's merchant fleet was destroyed. 7 million tons of oil shipping vanished, including the majority of Japan's tanker fleet. Submarine forces, despite accounting for only 2% of U.S. Navy personnel, delivered over 30% of all Japanese losses at sea. These figures are staggering. Japan's empire, which once relied on sea lanes for survival, had been starved and dismantled by a force smaller than many would ever believe possible. The U.S. submarine campaign was more than tactical brilliance, it was strategic genius. Its impact went far beyond sinking ships, crippling Japan's war economy. Without fuel, raw materials, or food, industrial output collapsed. Neutralizing Japan's military aircraft carriers and battleships were immobilized, forcing Japan into desperation. Troop movements were slowed, and islands were isolated before reinforcement. Psychological dominance, fear of unseen submarines, undermined morale at all levels. By controlling the ocean, the silent service ensured that Japan could not fight a conventional war even when it still possessed manpower and warships. By the summer of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed mostly on paper. Japan's merchant fleet was a shadow of its former self. Troops were stranded on Pacific islands with dwindling supplies. Civilian populations faced severe shortages of fuel and food. And all of this devastation had been accomplished without a single massive fleet engagement. The silent service had rewritten the rules of naval warfare, proved that submarines could be decisive in total war, and delivered a level of strategic shock the Japanese command could never have imagined. American submarines had done what carriers and battleships alone could not. They strangled an empire silently, efficiently, and irreversibly. The war in the Pacific officially ended on August 15, 1945, when Japan announced its surrender. But the story of its collapse at sea, the hidden, relentless assault by the U.S. submarine force, offers a perspective far more shocking than any headline-grabbing battle or kamikaze attack. By the time Tokyo capitulated, the silent service had achieved something almost unimaginable. It had crippled a modern navy and an entire empire without ever facing it in a full-scale naval engagement. The scale of destruction left Japan utterly dependent on the mercy of the ocean. When the Japanese finally assessed the damage, over 1,300 ships had been lost. More than 5 million tons of shipping vanished beneath the waves. Japan's oil tankers critical for the Navy and Air Force were nearly all destroyed. Islands and military garrisons were stranded without supplies. Civilians suffered shortages of food, coal, and fuel that contributed to widespread suffering. Japanese naval planners admitted in post-war interrogations that they had completely underestimated the submarine threat. We were obsessed with carrier battles and battleships, but it was the quiet predator beneath the waves that destroyed our empire. We could not believe how lethal and patient they were. It was a war Japan thought it could win on surface fleets alone, but beneath the ocean it had already lost. The success of the U.S. submarine campaign was not just measured in ships sunk, it was in strategic transformation. Changing naval doctrine forever, submarines proved they could decimate a nation's war-making capability without ever firing on a capital ship. Innovating tactics and intelligence, wolfpack operations and code-breaking showed that submarines could act as precision strategic weapons, not just commerce raiders, empowering a small force to deliver outsized impact. Only about 2% of U.S. Navy personnel served in the submarine service, yet they destroyed over 30% of all Japanese shipping. Perhaps the most astonishing fact is this: Japan's industrial collapse at sea happened faster and more decisively than almost any land campaign. All because a handful of steel boats prowled the Pacific silently, methodically, and mercilessly. The silent service also exacted a steep cost from its own crews. Submarine duty was among the most dangerous in the Navy, with over 3,500 Americans killed in action. Crews endured 2-month patrols underwater, often with torpedo malfunctions, depth charge attacks, and psychological strain. Despite these dangers, morale and skill skyrocketed once the torpedo problems were resolved. Heroes like Dudley Mush Morton, Richard O'Kane, Eugene Fluckey, and others became legends not just for sinking tonnage, but for reshaping naval warfare and proving the strategic power of small, specialized forces. Their courage and innovation were quietly shaping the outcome of the Pacific War. Far from the headlines of Midway, Leyte Gulf, or Iwo, one of the most shocking elements of this story is that Japan never adapted adequately. They refused to implement effective convoy systems early in the war. Their anti-submarine warfare tactics lagged behind Western standards. They underestimated the strategic value of targeting merchant shipping. Even after losing hundreds of ships, they still deployed their submarines primarily against warships rather than logistics. In short, Japan's strategic blindness amplified the effect of the U.S. submarine campaign. A relatively small force caused catastrophic damage because Japan had designed itself for conventional battles, not for war under stealth and intelligence. This is why American submarines remain one of the most decisive yet underappreciated weapons of World War II. They didn't make headlines like aircraft carriers or B-29 bombers, but in terms of crippling the enemy's ability to fight, their effect was arguably unmatched. The story of America's submarines in the Pacific is one of innovation, patience, and precision. It's a story where courage met technology, where intelligence met daring, and where a small, specialized force achieved what armies could not: the effective strangulation of an empire. Imagine the vast Pacific Ocean, once the lifeblood of Japan's empire, now turned against it by silent steel hunters, prowling beneath the waves, unseen and unstoppable. Entire fleets were immobilized, oil shipments vanished, reinforcements never arrived, and Japan's strategic options disappeared. This was war in its most surgical and devastating form. If you were shocked by the scale of destruction the silent service inflicted, if the bravery and ingenuity of these submarine crews astonished you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into untold stories of World War II, revealing the heroes, tactics, and strategies that history books often overlook. Hit the like button, share this video, and miss the next episode where we explore the most daring and clever operations that changed the course of the Pacific War forever.